All right, so before we get into the philosophy and the neuroscience and whatever else, there's a guy definitely worth mentioning, a writer. This is a writer who spent his entire career asking the question, what is real? And he was asking this long before that question was considered serious or the kind of thing you'd get a TED Talk out of. So enter Philip K. Dick, or as I will call him here, PKD. So he was writing what I would say was philosophy, but he was hiding it in pulp science fiction from the 1950s through the 1970s and early 1980s, I guess, too. He was frequently broke, occasionally unhinged, and I would say about a good 30 years ahead of his time. He was probably the kind of guy that you wouldn't want to be stuck in an elevator with, but probably you should have listened to him if you were. So his books kept returning to the same basic situation, which is that there's an ordinary person who is slowly realizing that the reality around them is constructed or, I guess, manufactured. And that what they've been experiencing as solid and trustworthy is actually turning out to be a very convincing, I guess, stage set. Now, if you're at all familiar with Blade Runner, Total Recall, A Scanner Darkly, a Minority Report, Minority Report, The Man in the High Castle. These were all original stories by PKD. I mean, the details changed, but the sense of dread was always there. It had this general creeping suspicion that the floor isn't quite as solid as you think. Yeah, I mean, if you've read his stuff, you get the gist here. So people used to call this kind of writing like paranoid fiction, which to me just translates to that they just weren't ready for this kind of stuff. So PKD had a definition of reality that I used to think about a lot more than I probably should have. Many years ago, I did an independent study in metaphysics in college, and he was definitely a fun influence on that. So PKD once stated that reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Simple enough, right? Except I would say that lately that definition feels like a question with a slow lead, because a lot of things that used to not go away when you stop believing in them, like institutions or consensus, the general sense that there's a shared world out there, these things seem to be going away gradually, and then all at once. So P.K. Dick was considered, in his time, a fringe figure. So you could say that he was interesting in the way that I suppose slightly unhinged people are interesting so he was interesting from a comfortable distance. Let's just put it that way. But I would argue that he was just doing early field work, and unfortunately, he wasn't paid very well for it. And sadly, he died just before Blade Runner was released in 1982. Yes, another brilliant artist who did not live to see the fruits of his labors. So, okay. There's a French philosopher named Jean Baudrillard who, in 1981, essentially wrote a user manual for a world that wouldn't exist for probably another 20 years or so. So his idea was this. At some point, the copy of a thing becomes or became more real than the thing itself. And he called this hyperreality. So the simulation doesn't just represent reality. It replaces it. And once that happens, you can't go back to the original because the original starts to feel fake by comparison. So the example that he used was maps. If you made a map detailed enough that like every street, every blade of grass, eventually people would relate to the map instead of the actual territory. And the territory would then become the inconvenient version. We did that, just not with maps. So, well, let's take a look at that right there. The burger in the advertising. It's perfectly lit, architecturally assembled. It's glistening in a way that no actual burger has ever glistened. And that image is now what a burger is supposed to look like. The real burger, on the other hand, over there sitting in its wrapper looking sad and deflated, is a disappointment by comparison. So it's the simulation that sets the standard, right? The actual thing is just a rough draft. And this is basically the society we live in now. So let's scale that up to travel, relationships. Let's scale it up to what a meaningful life is supposed to look like. So let's say you're at some genuinely a canyon, a coastline by the ocean, somewhere that took some real effort to get to. And the first thing your brain does is it starts composing the photo, right? It starts framing this because apparently somewhere along the way, the experience and the documentation of the experience, those things switched places. The record became the point, and the moment became the raw material. And the strange part is, you know this is happening. You can feel it happening, but you take the photo anyway. Because the alternative, just standing there actually being somewhere with no proof, feels vaguely irresponsible. Like it didn't count or something. That's not a personal failure of presence or mindfulness or whatever the hell the wellness industry is currently calling it. That is a structural shift in how experience gets organized. So what happened is the copy basically ate the original, and we were just too busy photographing it or videotaping it to notice. There was a period not too long ago when most people in a given country were actually working from roughly the same set of facts. And this wasn't because everyone was smart or enlightened or I guess particularly interested in the truth. It was because the information infrastructure was actually pretty narrow. You had a few newspapers, maybe 3 channels. At least that's what I had growing up. You had like one anchor who told you what happened today, and he said it in a voice that made it sound like it was non-negotiable. So if you're old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, he would look into the camera and say something happened, and most of the country would think, okay, that happened. The man had a very trustworthy chin, but we'll go with that. And those were simpler times. Simpler, and also apparently we all needed to hold a civilization together, which I guess says something about civilizations. The thing is, it wasn't a perfect system. It had its own distortions and its own blind spots, of course. It had its own things that it discreetly decided not to mention, like entire categories of people and what was actually happening to them. But I will say this, it did produce something in retrospect. It seems almost like a luxury nowadays. A shared reality. A common that enough people were standing